Dr. Richard Morgan, still ministering to elders, persons living with dementia, and caregivers. In October of 2016, Cognitive Dynamics Foundation President Neurologist Dr. Daniel C. Potts traveled to North Huntingdon, Pennsylvania, with fellow dementia advocates Lynda Everman and Dr. Wendorf to interview retired Presbyterian pastor, author, and Clergy and Faith United Against Alzheimer's Coalition's co-convener, Dr. Richard Morgan, about his lifelong ministry to elders, persons living with dementia, and caregivers. In this interview, rich in faith, as well as stories and wisdom gained over the decades, Dr. Morgan speaks about several of his books, including Treasure for Alzheimer's, in which he wrote about his experiences using the art of Lester E. Potts, Jr. to engage persons with late-stage dementia residing in long-term care facilities.
Richard, tell me how your own journey into aging has shaped your ministry.
Well, really, I had older grandparents who influenced me, but I think at the age of 50, I became very engrossed in aging because I had a church, small church in North Carolina, where 70% of the members were 65 or older. Many of them are retired. And my feeling about the church was that usually for older people, they are patronized, they are hand out bulletins, sing in the choir. One of my best stories is the old Farmer Brown, who had an old Model T Ford, but he put it in the parlor of his home. He polished it, he loved it. He only took it out once a year on the 4th of July parade. And I always say that a lot of people in the church who are older are paraded once a year, older adults, or given menial tasks like handing out bulletins and so forth. So we developed in that little church a very unique ministry because I believe that God calls at every age, all the way. Moses was 80, Abraham was 75. So we worked out a really good ministry with those dear people. We even created a special program with their unique needs, bringing in people that would speak to where they are. And out of that situation the church became the impetus for a center, aging center in the town of Lenore. It was an incredible experience, all done for and with and by older people. And one of the most interesting things was, I said, you all still have a mission, even though you're 65, 75, 80. And they volunteered, some of them, to visit nursing home residents. That was a fantastic experience. So, I just have to say I was very honored in 1985. The city of Lenore made me Man of the Year for my work with older people. But there's a postscript to that. I was speaking at a conference at Lake Junaluska, and this dear gentleman came up. He must have been 85 to 90. He said, you know, Richard, you don't know anything about aging till you're my age. And I was about 60 then. I said, you know, you're right. So years later, I still keep thinking about those words because once I became 75 and older, some of the frailties of aging hit me hard. Vision, hearing obviously, and also neuropathy. So then I began realizing there's another ministry to that fourth age that's beyond the active older people. And out of that grew my real concern for aging. So it's been quite a journey. Worked for the Presbyterian Church USA. I edited Agenda, which is their quarterly newsletter, and was very involved in doing conferences on older adult ministry. So that in the year 2013, they awarded me the Legacy Award for my work with older adult ministry. So that's been a passion of my whole life.
Richard, you've been a prolific writer in your career. Tell us about some of your books and how that has been influential in your ministry as well.
I took early retirement at age 62 to become a writer. And Upper Room Books in Nashville, Tennessee was very, very helpful. My first book was called No Wrinkles on the Soul. Wrote that in 1992. There was very few books on spirituality of aging. Kathleen Fisher had a wonderful book called Winter Grace. But other than that, so Upper Room picked up this book. The first year it sold 8,000 copies because there was a need for a spiritual approach to aging. I mean, his medical approach is fine and all of that. So that was my first book. It's now out of print, but it was one of my best books because it dealt with the issue. You know, I've often said older people have three temptations: to decline, to whine, or to recline. And I like to say there's a fourth option, shine, with the Spirit. And that's what this book is all about. How can a person at any age when they're older shine with the Spirit? And I have many, many witnesses of people like that. That was my first book. My next book was I Never Found the Rocking Chair, which was autobiographical, because I retired at 62 and I'm still writing at 88, almost. So that was an interesting book. It caught, again, another need for people to realize that when they retire, they're not out to pasture on the shelf. I use the term refirement, not retirement, because retirement connotes passivity. And I think you can be active even if your body begins to crumble. You can be active as long as you live. I think God calls us, as I said earlier, to a vocation. Frederick Buechner said, what is vocation? It's where the deepest hunger of the world meets your greatest joy. And my greatest joy was with older people.
Richard, tell us about the ministry that you've had to people with Alzheimer's and other dementias and their caregivers.
Well, actually, it began in 1965. My mother was diagnosed with Parkinson's dementia. And I was a distant caregiver. My sister, bless her heart, was her primary caregiver. And when I would go to visit my mother and see her pathetic situation, it just moved me to tears. Finally, she died in 1967 at the age of 66. From that moment on, that became a passion for me. Working for and with people who had dementia. Why? Because in that time, and still true today some ways, people with dementia are pariahs. They're outsiders. They're on the margin. And that's one of the problems of the church, I'll mention later. And I felt like that's terrible. Or they're either pariahs or they're warehoused in nursing homes. So my mother was a great influence, even though she had dementia. Like your father's situation with Alzheimer's, her dementia influenced me deeply. And it was very sad when she died at that early age. So from that time on, I became really on a mission. When I was in Lenore as a small church pastor, I became a nursing home chaplain. And that was my real first contact with people with Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia. And in those days, that was back in the 70s and early 80s, not much was being done. And I learned to listen to these people and hear them because, as you know, there is a soul there. There's a person there. So the passion I had in those days was remembering, helping them to remember the story. I must have interviewed, I don't know how many people. The first one I remember was a dear lady who sat in the hall, never spoke, never interacted with anybody. And I said, you know, I knew you were a nurse. Can you tell me about that? Her name was Abby. She said, yeah, I was a nurse. I was one of the first to use the iron lung. And that caught me. So I said, would you like me to record your story? She said, well, I don't have a family, but that's fine. You can record it. And I said, I will give it to your minister. And I recorded her story, and what I did, I listened to her, wrote it down, and later on gave a copy to her minister. That began my concern for stories. So while I was there also in the nursing home, this book emerged called With Faces to the Evening Sun. Faith stories from the nursing home. Because everybody thinks of a nursing home as a place of death, debility, death, people just wasting away. I found in that particular nursing home and another one where I was, great faith stories. So that's what this book is about. In the evening sun, there is light, and so forth. So from then on, my concern grew for people with Alzheimer's and dementia. Even after I retired, or I refired, even then, I did interim ministries, but then I was always working in a nursing home with people with dementia, listening to their stories, just being there for them, to affirming their personhood when their mind was like a shell. And that was a very important time of my life. And then, of course, we moved here in 2003. Here I live in the midst of a community with memory care, 20 people diagnosed with Alzheimer's, many in personal care, and quite a few here in independent living. So the ministry goes on. That's what I was trying to say earlier. You're in this until you die. And I cannot say what a blessing it's been to me, the people who have influenced me with Alzheimer's and with dementia. So out of that, of course, came the book that Jane Thibault and I wrote called No Act of Love is Ever Wasted. And Jane is an incredible person, very spiritual. She was a Carmelite nun, became a Methodist, and she added so much to the book from her experience as a gerontologist. And we focus this on the spirituality of people with dementia. That's the focus of the whole book. And I'm going to take the liberty to read something that I think is very important. Jim Fowler was professor of theology at Emory University. He wrote the classic Stages of Faith Development. Incredible man. His wife sent me something he wrote. He developed Alzheimer's, and he wrote this shortly afterwards. They will remember. In those places of the heart where soul still lurks, they will remember. In tactile hunger for hands that caress and care, they will remember. At heaven's gates, where all the leaves of lost memories are restored, they will remember. All the loving fragments, melodies, touches, prayers, tales by which you love them. Angels will sing and dance and shout, sensing your love in those loveless joys. No act of love is ever wasted. So one of the things we started here 6 years ago was an Alzheimer's support group. And it meets so many needs, not just for the residents here, but for residents in the community who come. Every month we have different people coming, burned out from the stress of caregiving with people with dementia. That's been a highlight of my life too, because what happened was some of the people who went through this with a loved one continued to come to the group to offer themselves as support. I can think of at least 4 people. And people here come whose loved ones are in memory care. So that support group, I cannot say so much about the power of support groups for people with Alzheimer's. So as you can see, I've been involved in this really since 1965.
Richard, you mentioned how your experience with your mother's dementia really lit a fire and got you excited about trying to make a difference for these folks. Well, the same thing happened with me and my dad's Alzheimer's disease, and his incredible story of artistic creativity in someone who had never shown any talent for that, and how it just changed his life and transformed him, gave him hope, and gave everybody around him hope and inspiration. And so out of that story, Richard has really grown everything that we're a part of in our ministry through our foundation, Cognitive Dynamics. And one of the things that's been so incredible for me is to sort of develop a relationship with you around my father's creativity and art because of the things that you've done with that. And I thank you so much for your interest in it and for being so innovative and using Dad's art in a particularly unique way. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, this has been, talk about an incredible journey. One of my blessings was being able to contact Danny Potts and find out that his father had done this work after he had Alzheimer's. And of course, with my concern for people here with Alzheimer's, I immediately said, can you send me some of his paintings? So he sent me a whole portfolio of Lester Potts Jr.'s work. And what I did was go up and visit people, mainly in the memory care, but there were 1 or 2 in personal care, who had been diagnosed either with Alzheimer's or vascular dementia or some other form of dementia. I didn't know what was going to happen. I sat down with, most times, one-on-one, sometimes a little group around a table, and I just showed them the pictures. I never said a word. I said, I want you to look at these beautiful paintings and tell me what you see, what you feel. I was amazed. One person who had never spoke said, when he showed the picture that your father did of the boat, he said, I was in the Navy. And that picture reminds me of being in the Navy. And he talked a little bit more. He had never spoken, in my knowledge, at least to me. And there was another dear lady there who likes to sing. And when I showed the picture of the fence, what she said was, I'm fenced in here. Perfect. And she said, I'm going to sing a song. And she sang the whole song of Don't Fence Me In. I'll never forget it. She was there yesterday. So that made me continue. What I would do is after I conducted the interview, I'd go into a room and write down what they said. It was so powerful. One man was a retired doctor, and all he did was wander around up there with like he was still checking patients with charts. And he looked at the book and he said, I like the cover. That's all he said. but he never spoke. He went around acting like he was still a doctor, but he said, I like the cover of your father's art. And one of my favorite stories is of a dear lady who language was very garbled, couldn't understand her, but I know her person was there. Her soul was there because she always came to worship. And my wife Allison and I conducted worship there, and at the end of every worship we would say Namaste, which means the God in me welcomes the God in you. And this lady was always there. And when she saw the picture of the butterfly, beautiful picture, she said, you know, that's like my life. I was transformed spiritually by God. I was just awestruck. Like the lady who once said, someone asked her, what is your name? She said, well, I don't know my name, but God does. And I found more spirituality, more sensitivity to God there than I ever find in the church. I'll be honest with you. It's wonderful to see these people just emerge. In fact, this is something that spoke to me in one of your writings. Ring the bells that still can ring, forget your perfect offering. There's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in, by Leonard Cohen. I saw that. Crackpots, minds gone, verbal language disappearing. Yet there was light there if we took time just to listen. So that became a wonderful experience. I'll never forget this book. You sent me a treasure. We'll find out later the name of another book. But it became a treasure, and unfortunately, so many of the dear people whom I interviewed have died or gone to the nursing home. But I still carry on with this book. So thank you.
Well, Richard, this has been a treasure for all of us, our entire family, and good things are coming from your work in this way, believe me.
One more story that, again, I'll never forget. Your father's wonderful painting of the boat on shore. We were sitting at a table. There were three of them, three people with dementia. One never spoke. And one man said, yeah, I'm grounded. That's all he said. But the lady sitting there said, yeah, but look at the flowers. There's new life coming out of that ship. I'll never forget that. And they were people who hardly ever spoke. And they would sing, because music is the other great way to reach people with dementia. But other than that, these were the words they said.
Well, you know, Lester was the old boat that was washed up on shore, and there were beautiful things coming out of him as well. So it's a metaphor for his life as well.
Right.
You know, and you actually took your experiences and the things that you wrote and the reflections and produced a book called Treasure for Alzheimer's. And this is a beautiful book. And tell us a little bit about your thoughts about that book.
Well, I felt like this was groundbreaking to find people with Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia being able to respond to art. To me, this was, I'm not an artist. I'm more interested in music than art. But I said, this is groundbreaking. So then when I talked to you and I said, can I use some of your pictures? What I'll do is tell the narratives of what they said. And that became the book. It was literally a treasure. We have this treasure in earthen vessels. I kept thinking about that. And it was a treasure. What they said was a treasure that needed to be preserved. For not only now, but for future generations to realize that there are people with this terrible disease who can tell you something through the art. Your father's art, who had Alzheimer's, communicated with these people who had Alzheimer's. That's an incredible reality. And I don't think I've heard much about that.
Richard, there's not much written about that. And I don't think we really know how the art or creativity of a person with dementia can maybe particularly communicate to someone else who has dementia. There may be something about the minds, that the way they see things that's similar. So it may be that it speaks more to them. And so I think more research is needed along those lines. And I'm reminded by that quote by Albert Schweitzer that you and I both love about the worth of a human being be the colors that human being produces in another life.
Wow.
And that's exactly what Lester did, and that's exactly what you have done in your use of this art with other people. So thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Richard, what do you hope your legacy will be in terms of your work with people with Alzheimer's and other dementias and their caregivers?
Well, I'll have to say, first of all, I always liked what Thomas Jefferson said, the words that are inscribed on his grave. Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence, author of the Virginia Statutes for Religious Freedom, father of the University of Virginia. And someone asked him, why didn't you put President of the United States? He said, that's what people did for me. This is what I did for people. I think it's perfect. So my legacy is not, I'll begin earlier, it's not just with Alzheimer's. All my life, I've been a champion of the the outsider, the marginalized, the left outs of society. In 1964, I sided with black children and their parents in a ghetto in South Carolina. So upset the power structure, I lost my job. And when I go to heaven, I will say to God, this is something I did, because I'll never forget that. But my legacy now is what I've been able to accomplish by the grace of God with people with Alzheimer's. I look back now at all that's happened since 1965 up to the present and to the future. And that's my legacy. That's what I'll leave. That'll be in my obituary. That this was somebody who cared about other people, who were left out, left behind, marginalized, outsiders that nobody else wants to even think about. In this book, Pilgrimage to the Later Stages of Life, which again co-authored with Jane Thibault, there is a section here called Leaving a Legacy. And both Jane and I talk about what our legacy is. And again, I reiterate that right now my legacy is working with people with Alzheimer's. Okay.
So we know that you are not a person to sit still. So tell us what is on your agenda now for the next epoch here.
Well, I'll need to get a lot of help. My wife's been a great help, but I need help from above too, because I have frailties now which have limited me, limited my travel, I don't drive anymore. My mind's still good. My brother Howard says that you may have the body of an 80-year-old, but you have the mind of a 30-year-old. And I feel that way. I feel very active thanks to PC and computer and so forth. But what's ahead? Only God knows. There's a wonderful line from Tennyson's poem of Ulysses. Old age has still its honor and its toil. Death closes all. But something ere the end, some work of noble note may yet be done. That's where I am, trying to still create a work of noble note, as Tennyson wrote about Ulysses. So what's ahead? God knows. I will continue my work here with people with dementia. I will continue to be a champion of those people. Still, it just worries me that so many of those people in memory care, a lot of their parents their children don't even visit them anymore. And I can't get clergy to visit. That's one of my real issues. A priest will come to give what they call last rites, but very few clergy visit these people, and they're all members of faith community. So that's still a mission for me. But so far, I've not been very successful with clergy, although I am a retired clergy. So that's part of my future, whatever years I have left. Another part will be, I'm through writing because the whole publishing world has totally changed. It's become virtual now. Everything is e-books. And so Psalms is my last book, thanks to two friends who helped me write that book. But I will continue, to be involved with people who have needs. My next project, he said, I think I told you, you heard what Picasso said, what is your greatest work? He said, the next one. And I'm still working with dementia issues. But my next one is neuropathy. To form here a support group for people with neuropathy, which is a terribly handicapping disease. Okay?
Perfect.
That's enough.
Perfect.